Marcus Reed felt like he was suffocating, even though the crisp autumn air around him should have brought some relief. His chest tightened with every step, his mind a whirlwind of anxious thoughts. He walked through the nature park in a desperate attempt to clear his head, but no matter how far he walked, no matter how many miles he left behind, he couldn't escape the storm brewing inside him. Everything in his life was supposed to be perfect. He was the heir to one of the most successful tech fortunes in the country, with more money than he could ever spend, a stunning wife, and a lifestyle that most people could only dream of. But deep down, he felt empty. Trapped. As the leaves crunched under his expensive leather shoes, Marcus clenched his fists, frustration boiling beneath the surface. How had he come to this? His whole life had been a series of meticulously planned moves, each decision made to ensure his success, his dominance in a world that revered power and status. But with all the control he thought he had, why did he feel like everything was slipping through his fingers? Why did he feel so lost? Suddenly, a sharp cry pierced the silence of the park, startling Marcus from his thoughts. It was the unmistakable sound of a baby, its wails cutting through the stillness like a blade. Instinctively, he turned toward the source of the noise. On a nearby bench, hunched over and cradling a small bundle in her arms, sat a woman. Her clothes were tattered, her hair a wild mess of tangles, and she rocked the child in a way that seemed both desperate and defeated. Something about the scene unsettled Marcus. Maybe it was the way the woman's shoulders shook with exhaustion, or the haunting look in her eyes as she gazed down at the infant. Or maybe it was something deeper, something more primal that he couldn't yet place. He took a step closer, his curiosity getting the better of him. "Is everything all right?" His voice, usually commanding and full of confidence, sounded softer, uncertain. The woman looked up slowly, her face lined with stress and fatigue. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and there was a rawness to her expression that tugged at something inside Marcus. She hesitated for a moment, glancing down at the baby, and for a fleeting second, Marcus thought she might ignore him. But then, she spoke. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I shouldn't be here." The cryptic reply only fueled Marcus's concern. His gaze shifted to the child in her arms, and that's when he saw it, a small birthmark on the baby's exposed arm. A birthmark that was an exact match to his own, a distinctive mark that he'd carried since birth. His pulse quickened, panic rising in his throat like bile. This couldn't be a coincidence. It was impossible. Marcus's mind raced, trying to make sense of the impossible. Was this some sick joke? A bizarre twist of fate? He took another step forward, his heart pounding in his chest. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice gaining strength. "Why does that baby have the same mark as me?" The woman shifted uncomfortably, tightening her grip on the baby. Her eyes darted around the park, as if she were searching for an escape. When she spoke again, her voice was barely a whisper, trembling with fear. "They told me I shouldn't stay here long. I was only supposed to leave him. And go." Marcus froze. Leave him? The words barely registered as his brain tried to process the implications. "What are you talking about?" She lowered her head, refusing to meet his gaze, and Marcus could feel the walls closing in around him. Everything he thought he knew, everything he believed about his life, was unraveling before his eyes. His breath quickened, his pulse hammering in his ears. This woman, this stranger, was hiding something. Something that had the power to destroy everything. "You don't understand," she said shakily. "I wasn't supposed to keep him. I was just supposed to take him." Marcus felt the ground shift beneath him. Take him? His mind rebelled against the words, against the chilling realization that began to take form. His gaze dropped to the baby in the woman's arms. This wasn't just any child. It was his child. Somehow, someway, this was his son. But how? How could that be possible? He hadn't been with anyone recently. Except Natalie. Natalie. Her name shot through his mind like a lightning bolt, a flood of memories overwhelming him. The woman he once loved. The woman he let go. They had parted ways years ago, both consumed by their ambitions. But it couldn't be. Could it? Who hired you? Marcus's voice was sharp now, laced with a fear he hadn't felt in years. The woman flinched at the harshness in his tone, but she remained silent. Tell me, he shouted, stepping closer, his emotions spiraling out of control. He was a man used to having answers, to being in control. But now, everything was slipping away, unraveling faster than he could grasp. He was drowning in confusion, in fear, in the overwhelming sense that his entire life had been built on a lie. The woman's lip quivered, and for a moment, Marcus thought she might break. Her grip on the child tightened, her knuckles white from the strain. I don't know, she stammered, her voice cracking. I never saw their faces. I don't know who they are. I couldn't do it. I couldn't leave him. Marcus felt his knees weaken, the weight of the situation pressing down on him like a physical force. He staggered back, running a hand through his hair as his world crumbled around him. Someone had hired this woman to take his child. His son. But why? And more importantly, who? His thoughts immediately went to Vivian, his wife. Beautiful, composed, ambitious. She had always been more interested in status and appearance than family. Could she be behind this? The thought twisted in his gut, making him feel sick. But no. She wouldn't. Would she? As Marcus stood there, struggling to make sense of the chaos that now consumed him, the baby let out another soft cry, as if sensing the tension in the air. The sound brought Marcus back to the present, grounding him in the terrifying reality before him. He had to find out the truth. He had to know who had orchestrated this and why they had wanted to take his son from him. Because now, everything was at stake. Cliffhanger, Marcus's life has been thrown into chaos. His son, a secret from his past, has been stolen by unknown forces. As he begins to question those closest to him, including his own wife, the tension builds. Can Marcus uncover the truth before it's too late? Marcus Reed sat in his study, staring blankly at the glass of scotch in his hand, but his mind was miles away. The events of the park still replayed in his head, over and over, like a nightmare on loop. The woman, the baby, the birthmark. His son. His son. How could that be possible? How could his life have spiraled so far out of control, so fast? He set the glass down and rubbed his temples, feeling the familiar sting of a headache forming. He had always prided himself on his control, on being able to outthink, outmaneuver, and outplan any obstacle that came his way. But now? Now he was stumbling in the dark, grasping its shadows. The unknown hung over him like a guillotine, ready to drop at any moment. His phone buzzed on the desk, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a text from Vivian, home late tonight. Meetings. Don't wait up. Marcus stared at the words, his stomach churning with a new kind of nausea. Could she be involved? The thought gnawed at him relentlessly, and though part of him wanted to dismiss it as paranoia, another part of him couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. After all, Vivian had always been possessive, protective of their public image. But would she go so far as to orchestrate a kidnapping? To take his own child? Marcus pushed away from his desk, the sudden need for answers overwhelming him. He couldn't sit here any longer, waiting for the truth to reveal itself. He had to find out what had really happened. And to do that, he needed to start digging into the past he had buried when he walked away from Natalie. It had been almost 3 years since Marcus had last seen Natalie. She was unlike anyone else in his life, a fierce, independent woman who refused to be defined by his wealth or influence. That was what had drawn him to her in the first place. Unlike the socialites and gold diggers that often surrounded him, Natalie didn't care about his status. She had her own ambitions, her own dreams. But it was those same ambitions that had driven them apart. Natalie had made it clear that her career came first, that she wasn't interested in settling down, at least not then. And Marcus, wrapped up in the whirlwind of his company's rapid expansion, had let her go. It had hurt, but he had convinced himself that it was for the best. After all, relationships were complicated, messy. And for someone like him, who thrived on control and precision, mess was a luxury he couldn't afford. But now, it seemed, that mess had come back to haunt him. Natalie had kept a secret from him, a secret that had taken the form of the child he never knew existed. His thoughts drifted back to the woman in the park. The fear in her eyes had been genuine. She had been desperate, but not in the way someone seeking money would be. No, her desperation had come from something deeper. Fear of those who had hired her. Fear of what they might do if she didn't comply. Marcus didn't waste any time. He had the resources, money, contacts, influence. If there was one thing he knew how to do, it was find answers. He called his most trusted investigator, a man named Julian. If anyone could get to the bottom of this, it was him. "I need you to find out everything about this woman," Marcus said, sliding a photo of the park encounter across the table in their meeting the next morning. "And more importantly, I need to know who she's working for." Julian nodded, his expression unreadable. He was a man of few words, but he was ruthless in his pursuit of information. "Consider it done," he replied before slipping out of the office. With Julian on the case, Marcus felt a brief flicker of hope. But that hope was quickly overshadowed by the growing dread that gnawed at his gut. Whoever was behind this was dangerous, and they had been able to get close, too close. Days passed with no word from Julian, and Marcus's frustration only grew. He was used to immediate results, but it seemed like this mystery was taking its sweet time to unfold. Then, just as his patience began to wear thin, his phone rang. "I found something." Julian's voice was steady, but there was an edge to it that made Marcus's heart race. "What is it?" "There's been a connection to your wife." Marcus's breath caught in his throat. He knew it. Deep down, he had feared this all along. "Go on," he said, his voice taut. "I traced a payment to a private account connected to the woman in the park. The account is linked to an offshore fund, which, in turn, ties back to one of Vivian's business ventures." The floor seemed to drop out from under Marcus. Vivian had been involved. She had paid for the kidnapping of his own child. But why? Why would she do this? He thanked Julian and hung up, his mind spinning. Vivian. The woman he had married, the woman he had built a life with, had orchestrated this entire nightmare. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. That night, Marcus waited for Vivian to come home. He sat in the darkened living room, the only light coming from the dim glow of the fireplace. The ticking of the clock on the mantel seemed louder than usual, each tick stretching his nerves thinner and thinner. Finally, the door opened, and Vivian walked in, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. She stopped when she saw him sitting there, her face betraying a flicker of surprise before she masked it with her usual composed smile. "Marcus, you're still up?" she asked, her tone casual, too casual. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stood up slowly, his eyes locked on hers. "We need to talk." Vivian raised an eyebrow, but there was something guarded in her expression. She set down her purse, her eyes never leaving his. "All right," she said, her voice steady. "What's this about?" Marcus crossed the room, the distance between them shrinking with each step. He stopped in front of her, his voice cold. "I know about the child, Vivian." There it was. A flicker of something in her eyes, fear? Panic? It was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a look of calculated indifference. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice smooth, but Marcus could hear the crack in her composure. "Don't lie to me," he said, his voice rising. "I know you paid that woman to take him. I know you've been hiding this from me." Vivian's mask of calm slipped, and for the first time, Marcus saw the raw, desperate emotion beneath. I did what I had to do, Marcus. I did it for us. For us? Marcus spat, his voice thick with disbelief. You kidnapped my child and you think that was for us? Vivian's eyes flashed with anger. That child wasn't part of the plan. I've worked too hard, sacrificed too much, to let some mistake from your past ruin everything. Marcus stepped back, shocked by the venom in her voice. He's not a mistake, Vivian. He's my son. Our son, she corrected, her voice trembling. We're building a future, Marcus. A family, an empire. I wasn't going to let some woman from your past come in and destroy all of that. Marcus stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. She hadn't just been driven by jealousy or insecurity, this was about power. Control. She had seen Natalie and the child as threats to the carefully constructed life she had built with him, and she had done the unthinkable to eliminate them. How could you? Marcus whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Vivian stepped forward, her eyes pleading. I did it for us, Marcus. Don't you see? I love you. I did it because I love you. But her words only deepened the rift between them. Marcus shook his head, his heart breaking. That's not love, Vivian. That's control. The confrontation with Vivian left Marcus shaken to his core. The woman he had trusted, the woman he had built a life with, had betrayed him in the most devastating way possible. But as the dust settled, a new fear crept in, the fear of what else she was capable of. If she had orchestrated this kidnapping, what else was she hiding? How far was she willing to go to protect her empire? Marcus knew he couldn't stay in that house. He couldn't look at Vivian without feeling a surge of anger and betrayal. So, he packed a bag and left, leaving behind the life they had built together. As he drove away, the city lights blurring past him, Marcus's mind raced. He had lost everything, his trust in Vivian, his sense of security, his belief in the life he had worked so hard to create. And yet, in the midst of the chaos, one thing was clear, he needed to find Natalie. He needed to find his son. Because now, everything he had fought for, everything he had believed in, was gone. And all that mattered was reclaiming the only thing that truly mattered, his family. Cliffhanger, Marcus is now a man on the run, both from his past and the wreckage of his present. With Vivian's betrayal exposed, and the safety of his son in jeopardy, Marcus must race against time to uncover the full truth and find Natalie before it's too late. If you are enjoying this story, don't forget to subscribe. The hum of the engine was the only sound filling the silence in Marcus Reed's car as he sped down the highway, his thoughts racing faster than the speedometer. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white, heart pounding. After everything he'd uncovered about Vivian, after realizing the extent of her betrayal, Marcus's world had been ripped apart. But that wasn't the end, it couldn't be. He needed to find Natalie. He needed answers, and more importantly, he needed his son. He had left the estate in a rush, unable to bear staying in the same house with a woman who had orchestrated such a cruel plan. Vivian's calm confession still echoed in his mind, her cold logic, I did it for us. How could she be so deluded? She had kidnapped his child, lied to him, and shattered what little trust remained between them. But now, Marcus had to push that betrayal aside. His focus needed to shift to what truly mattered, protecting his son from any more harm. But the deeper Marcus drove into his past, the murkier everything became. Natalie had left without much of an explanation, and they hadn't spoken since their breakup. Why had she kept his child a secret? Why hadn't she reached out to him? The more he thought about it, the more questions gnawed at him, and he wasn't sure if he'd ever be prepared for the answers. The address Julian had tracked down for Natalie wasn't far. She had relocated to a small coastal town, away from the chaos of the city, the place where she had once thrived in her career. As Marcus neared the town, he felt a tightening in his chest. The memories of their relationship flooded back with a sudden intensity. He had never fully gotten over her, perhaps he never would. She had been a force in his life, someone who made him question his own values, his motivations. But now, that force had turned into a storm, one that was threatening to pull him under. Marcus parked the car a few blocks from Natalie's small cottage, a modest home that stood in stark contrast to the penthouse lifestyle he was accustomed to. As he walked toward the house, the sound of the waves crashing on the shore nearby seemed to match the turmoil inside him. He paused at the gate, taking a deep breath, steeling himself for whatever might come next. He knocked, each rap on the door louder than the last. His heart pounded in anticipation, and for a moment, he thought she might not answer. But then, the door swung open, and there she stood. Natalie. She was just as he remembered, strong, confident, with that fire in her eyes that had always captivated him. But there was something else now, a weariness that hadn't been there before. She stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "Marcus," she finally said, her voice steady but laced with surprise. "I didn't expect to see you here." "I didn't expect to be here," Marcus admitted, his voice tight. "But things have changed." Natalie frowned, stepping aside to let him in. The inside of the house was cozy, filled with books, soft lighting, and the smell of fresh coffee. It felt worlds away from the sleek, modern life Marcus had built for himself in the city. He didn't waste any time with small talk. "I know about the child, Natalie. I know he's mine." Her face paled, and for a moment, she looked like she might collapse under the weight of the revelation. But then, slowly, she nodded, her eyes never leaving his. "Yes," she whispered. "He's yours, Marcus." Marcus exhaled sharply, the confirmation hitting him harder than he'd expected. Even though he had known it in his gut, hearing her say the words brought the truth crashing down on him. "Why didn't you tell me?" His voice was raw, filled with hurt. "Why didn't you reach out?" Natalie sank into a chair, her posture deflated. She looked up at him with eyes full of regret. "I wanted to, Marcus. I really did. But when I found out I was pregnant, we were already drifting apart. You were so focused on your career, on the company, and I knew I couldn't be part of that world. I didn't want to be a complication for you. I thought I was doing the right thing by leaving." Marcus shook his head, the frustration and anger bubbling to the surface. "You didn't have the right to make that decision for me, Natalie. He's my son too. You should have told me." "I know," she whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. "I know I made a mistake. But by the time I realized it, too much time had passed. I didn't know how to come back." Marcus could feel the rage building inside him, but he forced himself to calm down. There was no point in blaming her now. They couldn't change the past. All that mattered was what came next. "Someone tried to take him," Marcus said, his voice cold. "Vivian, my wife, she was behind it. She hired a woman to kidnap him." Natalie's eyes widened, shock and fear flashing across her face. "What? But why? Why would she do that? Jealousy, power, control, who knows?" Marcus said bitterly. "But she's dangerous, Natalie. I came here to protect him, to keep both of you safe." Natalie was silent for a long time, processing everything he had just told her. Finally, she spoke, her voice trembling. "I never thought this would happen. I thought I was keeping him safe by staying away." Marcus felt a pang of guilt. Maybe if he hadn't been so focused on his own life, so wrapped up in his ambition, none of this would have happened. But now wasn't the time for self-pity. They needed to act, and fast. "We need to leave," Marcus said, urgency creeping into his voice. "Vivian won't stop until she gets what she wants." Natalie nodded, fear evident in her eyes, but before either of them could move, a sudden knock at the door startled them both. Marcus froze, his pulse spiking with alarm. Natalie stood, her face pale. Who could that be? Marcus moved toward the door cautiously, his mind racing with worst-case scenarios. Was it Vivian? Had she tracked them down? His hand hovered over the doorknob as he debated whether or not to open it. But before he could decide, the door burst open, revealing a figure Marcus hadn't expected to see. Julian stepped inside, his expression dark and unreadable. Marcus's heart dropped as a chilling realization washed over him. Something was wrong. Very wrong. Julian? Marcus's voice was filled with confusion. What the hell are you doing here? Julian didn't answer immediately. Instead, he closed the door behind him, locking it with a sharp click. Marcus's instincts kicked in, and he stepped in front of Natalie protectively. What's going on? Marcus demanded, his voice sharp. Julian finally spoke, his tone cold and emotionless. I'm sorry, Marcus. But I wasn't working for you this whole time. Marcus felt the air leave his lungs. What are you talking about? Julian's expression remained steely, his eyes narrowing. You weren't the only one paying for my services. Vivian hired me first. She knew you'd come looking for the truth, and she wanted to make sure she controlled the narrative. The betrayal hit Marcus like a freight train. Julian, the man he had trusted with his darkest secrets, the man he had relied on to uncover the truth, had been playing him from the start. Vivian's pulling the strings, Julian continued, his voice eerily calm. She's been one step ahead of you this entire time. She knew you'd find Natalie eventually. That's why I'm here. Marcus's heart pounded in his chest, fury and disbelief mixing in equal measure. So what now? You're going to turn us over to her? Julian shrugged, his expression indifferent. Vivian wants control, Marcus. She doesn't want this to get messy, so she sent me to handle it quietly. Natalie clutched Marcus's arm, fear evident in her eyes. Marcus's mind raced. He couldn't let Julian take them. He couldn't let Vivian win. But they were trapped, with no way out. Do you really think Vivian's going to let you walk away from this clean? Marcus said, his voice low, hoping to reason with Julian. Once you're no longer useful, she'll turn on you too. That's how she operates. You know that. Julian's jaw tightened, but Marcus could see the doubt flickering in his eyes. She's not going to stop until she has everything, Marcus pressed. She'll destroy you like she's trying to destroy me. For a moment, there was silence. Then, Julian's face softened slightly, his resolve wavering. You don't get it, Marcus, Julian said, his voice quieter now. I'm already too deep. I can't walk away from this. Marcus's mind raced, desperation fueling his next move. He stepped forward, his voice pleading. You can still get out of this, Julian. We both can. But you have to help me. We have to stop her. Julian's eyes locked with Marcus's, the tension between them thick enough to cut. For a long moment, it seemed like he might side with Vivian, that he might finish what he came here to do. But then, something shifted in his expression, hesitation, regret. I didn't want it to go this far, Julian muttered under his breath. He glanced at Natalie, then back at Marcus. But I can't undo what's been done. Before Marcus could respond, Julian pulled out a small device from his pocket. It was a tracker. She's already coming, Marcus. You need to go now. Marcus's stomach dropped as he realized what that meant. Vivian was on her way. They had minutes, if that, before she arrived. Take the back road, Julian said, his voice tense. I'll stall her as long as I can, but you have to disappear. Marcus didn't waste any time. He grabbed Natalie's hand, pulling her toward the back door. They didn't look back. As Marcus and Natalie fled into the night, his mind was a chaotic storm of emotions. Julian's betrayal had blindsided him, leaving him reeling. He had trusted the wrong person, and now everything was spiraling out of control. But worse than that, Vivian was closing in, and he wasn't sure if he could protect his son. "Marcus," Natalie said breathlessly as they hurried toward his car. "What are we going to do?" Marcus looked at her, guilt washing over him. He had dragged her into this mess, and now their lives were in danger. He didn't have the answers. All he had was the overwhelming urge to protect his family. "We keep running," Marcus said, his voice hardening. "We don't stop until she's out of the picture." But deep down, Marcus knew that outrunning Vivian wouldn't be enough. She was ruthless, determined, and now more dangerous than ever. If he wanted to save his son, if he wanted to stop this nightmare, there was only one option left: he had to confront her. And this time, he wouldn't hesitate. If you are enjoying this story, don't forget to subscribe. The wind howled through the trees as Marcus Reed drove through the winding back roads, his knuckles white against the steering wheel, tension coursing through his body like electricity. Beside him, Natalie sat rigid, her face pale but resolute, her eyes reflecting the same fear and determination that coursed through Marcus. They had no time to lose. Behind them, somewhere in the darkness, Vivian was closing in. The realization sat like a heavy weight in his gut: this was it. This was the final stretch. There was no running, no hiding. It was only a matter of time before they would have to confront her. But it wasn't just Vivian's wrath that hung over them like a storm, it was everything. The betrayal, the lies, the weight of Marcus's failures. For years, he had prided himself on being in control of his life, his destiny, but now, everything was unraveling. His perfect, carefully constructed world had collapsed in a matter of days. He was no longer the powerful businessman who could buy his way out of any problem. He was a father, a terrified, vulnerable father, desperate to save his son from the chaos he had unwittingly allowed into their lives. "Where are we going?" Natalie asked, her voice cutting through the tension, barely above a whisper. Marcus hesitated. He didn't have an answer. Not a real one. He was flying blind, reacting on pure instinct. All he knew was that they needed to keep moving, to stay ahead of Vivian for as long as possible. But for how long? And what then? His thoughts were a jumble of conflicting emotions: fear, guilt, anger, desperation. But there was something else too. Resolve. "We'll go to the cabin," Marcus finally said, his voice tight. "It's secluded, off the grid. She won't find us there." "Not right away." Natalie nodded, though her hands were clenched tightly in her lap. The cabin. A relic of his family's old life, tucked away in the mountains where no one would think to look. It was their only option, their last refuge before the inevitable confrontation with Vivian. As they drove, the weight of everything that had happened pressed down on Marcus. His mind drifted to thoughts of his son, the boy he hadn't even met yet, but whose existence had turned his world upside down. A child he hadn't been given the chance to protect. The mere thought of what Vivian had planned for him sent waves of guilt and anger crashing through Marcus's chest. "I failed him," Marcus muttered, his grip tightening on the wheel. "I failed my son before I even knew he existed." Natalie turned to him, her expression softening despite the fear in her eyes. "No, Marcus. You didn't know. You couldn't have known." "But I should have been there," Marcus shot back, his voice cracking with emotion. "I should have been there for you, for him. I let my ambition blind me, and now he's paying the price." Natalie's hand found his on the steering wheel, her touch warm and grounding. "We're going to fix this. Together. We'll protect him." Marcus's throat tightened, and for the first time in days, he felt something other than fear. He felt hope. Natalie was right. They weren't alone in this. They had each other, and more than that, they had a reason to fight. A reason to win. The storm breaks. They arrived at the cabin as the first droplets of rain began to fall, the sky above them dark and ominous, mirroring the storm brewing inside Marcus. He and Natalie hurried inside, locking the door behind them, the cabin's small interior offering a fragile sense of safety. The fireplace crackled to life as Marcus lit it, casting flickering shadows across the walls. For a brief moment, there was silence. The cabin was secluded enough that it felt like they were the only people left in the world. But Marcus knew better. Vivian would come. She always did. Sitting by the fire, Natalie pulled a blanket around her shoulders, her eyes distant, lost in thought. Marcus sat beside her, his mind churning with the weight of everything they had yet to face. He couldn't help but wonder, would they survive this? Would his son grow up with the family he deserved, or would Vivian's twisted ambitions destroy them all? The door creaked suddenly, the wind pushing it slightly open, sending a chill through Marcus's spine. His heart pounded in his chest. Every noise, every movement felt like a prelude to the chaos that was sure to come. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw movement through the window, shadows shifting outside, barely discernible in the darkness. His blood ran cold. "She's here," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible. Natalie's breath hitched, her eyes wide with fear. "What do we do?" Marcus stood, his body tense, adrenaline flooding his system. There was no time to think, only time to act. He moved toward the door, his heart pounding in his ears, but before he could reach for the handle, a loud bang echoed through the cabin. The front door slammed open, and there she stood, Vivian. Drenched from the rain, her eyes blazing with fury, Vivian stepped into the cabin, her presence commanding, her rage palpable. Marcus felt the air leave his lungs. This was it. The moment he had been dreading. The final confrontation. "I told you, Marcus," Vivian said, her voice cold and sharp, like the crack of a whip. "You can't run from me." The emotional showdown. Marcus squared his shoulders, standing between Vivian and Natalie. "You need to stop this, Vivian. It's over." "Over?" Vivian laughed, the sound harsh and bitter. "You think this is over?" "It's far from over, Marcus. You betrayed me. You turned your back on everything we built together. You let that woman and her bastard child ruin us." "That's not true," Marcus snapped, his voice rising with anger. "The only person who's been destroying anything is you. You couldn't stand the thought of losing control, so you tried to take my son." Vivian's face contorted with rage. "Your son? Our life, Marcus. I was building a future for us. I did what I had to do to protect what we had. You call this protection?" Marcus shouted, his emotions finally breaking free. "You tried to kidnap an innocent child. You tried to destroy a family because of your own insecurities." For a moment, Vivian's mask of anger faltered, revealing the deep-seated fear and desperation beneath. But it was only for a moment. Her eyes hardened again, and she took a step closer, her voice low and venomous. "You have no idea what it's like, Marcus," she hissed. "To give up everything, to sacrifice everything for someone, only to have it all ripped away. I built my life around you. I gave up my own dreams, my own ambitions, to support yours. And for what? So you could throw it all away for her?" "This was never about her," Marcus said, his voice breaking. "It's about you, Vivian. You couldn't handle the fact that you can't control everything. That's why you did this. But you can't control me. And you can't control him." Vivian's eyes flickered with fury, but behind that, Marcus saw something else, something raw, broken. She wasn't just angry. She was terrified. Terrified of losing everything, of being left with nothing. "I loved you, Marcus," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I did everything for you." Marcus's heart ached, but it wasn't sympathy he felt. It was sorrow. Sorrow for the woman who had once been his partner, the woman who had become twisted by her own fear of losing him. But there was no going back now. Too much had been broken. Too much had been lost. "I know you did," Marcus said softly, his voice filled with regret. "But love doesn't mean control. And it doesn't mean destruction." Vivian stared at him, her eyes brimming with unshed tears, but she didn't move. For a moment, Marcus thought she might back down, that she might realize the futility of what she was doing. But then her expression hardened, and Marcus's heart sank. "If I can't have you," Vivian said, her voice icy, "then no one can." She reached into her coat and pulled out a gun. Time seemed to slow as Marcus's mind raced. Vivian stood there, the gun in her hand shaking slightly, her eyes wild with desperation. The rain outside beat against the cabin windows, the storm outside reflecting the storm within. "Vivian, don't do this," Marcus said, his voice low, calm, though his heart was pounding in his chest. "This isn't you." But Vivian's hand tightened on the gun, her eyes locking onto Marcus's. "You're wrong, Marcus. This is exactly who I am." Marcus glanced back at Natalie, who was frozen in fear, her eyes wide with terror. He knew he had to do something, anything, to stop Vivian. But how? He had no weapon, no plan. Only words. "Vivian, if you pull that trigger, there's no coming back from this," Marcus said, his voice steady. "Do you really want that? Is that how you want this to end?" For a moment, Vivian's hand wavered. Marcus could see the internal battle raging inside her, the part of her that wanted to lash out, to destroy everything, and the part of her that still clung to the life they had once shared. But then, in the blink of an eye, her resolve hardened. "I'm not going to lose you," Vivian whispered, raising the gun higher. Marcus's pulse spiked. He took a step forward, slowly, cautiously. "You've already lost me, Vivian. This isn't about us anymore. It's about our son. If you love me, if you ever loved me, then let this go." Vivian's eyes filled with tears, and for a split second, Marcus thought she might drop the gun. But before he could take another step, the door to the cabin burst open, and Julian appeared, soaking wet and out of breath. "Vivian, stop!" Julian shouted, his voice cracking through the tension. Vivian's head snapped toward him, the gun still raised, her eyes wild with confusion. "Julian? What are you doing here?" Julian's gaze flicked to Marcus, then back to Vivian. "I can't let you do this. You need to stop. It's over." Vivian's hand trembled, her grip on the gun faltering. "You were supposed to help me," she whispered, her voice filled with betrayal. "I did help you," Julian said, stepping closer, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "But this isn't the way. You don't want this." For a long, agonizing moment, everything hung in the balance. Marcus held his breath, waiting for the explosion of violence he feared was inevitable. But then, slowly, Vivian's arm began to lower, the gun slipping from her grasp as the weight of her actions finally caught up with her. "It's over," Julian repeated, his voice softer now. "You don't have to do this." Vivian's shoulders slumped, and she let out a ragged sob, the gun clattering to the floor. Marcus exhaled, his entire body shaking with relief. It was over. The nightmare was finally over. Hours later, the storm had passed, and the cabin was quiet again. The police had come and taken Vivian into custody, her face a mask of defeat as they led her away. Julian had stayed behind, his expression grim, though there was a sense of finality in his presence now. Marcus stood by the window, staring out at the rain-soaked landscape, his mind still reeling from everything that had happened. Natalie joined him, her hand slipping into his, her touch warm and comforting. "Is it really over?" she asked softly, her voice filled with exhaustion. Marcus nodded, though the weight of what they had just been through still lingered in the air. "Yeah. It's over." But even as he said the words, he knew that the scars of this battle would stay with them for a long time. He had faced his darkest fears, confronted the worst parts of himself and the people he thought he knew. And though the storm had passed, the damage it had left behind was real. But for the first time in a long time, Marcus felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. The future was uncertain, and the road ahead would be difficult, but he wasn't alone. He had Natalie, and he had his son. And together, they would rebuild. Together, they would find a way to heal. As Marcus held Natalie close, the fire crackling softly behind them, he knew one thing for certain: no matter how dark things had gotten, they had survived. They had come through the storm. And they were still standing. If you are enjoying this story, don't forget to subscribe. The morning light streamed softly into the cottage, casting a warm glow on the kitchen where Marcus sat, hands wrapped around a mug of coffee. It had been 3 weeks since the night at the cabin, since Vivian's arrest and the terrifying showdown that could have destroyed his life. The chaos had subsided, but the emotional weight of it all lingered like a shadow. Marcus had spent his life chasing control, trying to master every aspect of his world, but now, for the first time, he was learning to let go. As he stared into his coffee, Natalie entered the room, their son cradled in her arms. She looked at him with that same gentle warmth that had always grounded him, and for a moment, Marcus felt something unfamiliar: peace. He watched as she laid the baby down in the bassinet and sat across from him, her eyes full of unspoken understanding. "How are you feeling?" she asked softly. Marcus sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Different," he said honestly. "Everything's changed. I'm not the same person I was." "You're not," Natalie agreed, a soft smile playing on her lips. "You've grown, Marcus. You've faced things most people never have to face, and you've come out stronger." He nodded, her words sinking in. For years, he had lived in the pursuit of power, believing that success and control would bring him happiness. But all that had done was isolate him, distance him from the people who truly mattered. The last few weeks had stripped away those illusions, forcing him to confront his deepest fears, his failures, and, most importantly, his heart. "I almost lost everything," Marcus murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "You, our son. I was so blinded by ambition, by trying to keep everything perfect." "But you didn't lose us," Natalie replied, her hand finding his. "We're still here." The warmth of her touch brought Marcus back to the present. He had spent so much time trying to control every aspect of his life that he had forgotten what it meant to simply live. Now, as he sat across from the woman he loved and the son he had nearly lost, he realized that control wasn't the answer. Letting go was. Over the following weeks, Marcus and Natalie began the slow process of rebuilding. Marcus had stepped away from his company, handing over the day-to-day operations to trusted colleagues while he focused on what truly mattered: his family. They moved into a quieter town, far from the chaos of the city, where they could raise their son in peace. It wasn't the life Marcus had envisioned for himself, but it was one that filled him with a sense of purpose and fulfillment he had never known. Each day, Marcus found joy in the little things: walking on the beach with Natalie, watching their son take his first steps. The simple, quiet moments of family life became his new source of strength. He no longer needed the accolades, the power, or the control that had once driven him. Instead, he found happiness in the present, in the love he shared with his family. One evening, as they sat together watching the sunset, Marcus turned to Natalie, a sense of contentment filling his chest. "I used to think I needed everything to be perfect," he said softly. "That I had to control every part of my life to be happy. But I was wrong." Natalie smiled at him, her eyes warm. "You've learned to let go." Marcus nodded, his heart full. "And it's the best thing I've ever done." In the months that followed, Vivian's trial unfolded, her actions exposed to the world. She had been sentenced to prison for her role in the kidnapping and her manipulation of those around her. Though Marcus felt a sense of closure, it wasn't without sadness. He had once loved her, but that love had long since been consumed by her obsession with control. Now, she was paying the price for the choices she had made. Julian, too, had faced the consequences of his betrayal. Though he had ultimately helped Marcus, their friendship was irreparably damaged. Trust, Marcus knew, was something that couldn't be easily restored. As time passed, Marcus continued to embrace his new life. He had learned the value of vulnerability, of letting go of the need for control. His priorities had shifted, and with them, his entire outlook on life. He no longer measured success by his career or wealth, but by the love and connection he had with his family. Sitting by the fire one evening, Marcus reflected on the journey he had been through. The man he was now was not the same man who had once believed that control was the key to happiness. He had faced his greatest fears, endured heartbreak and betrayal, but in the end, he had emerged stronger, more whole. He looked over at Natalie, their son asleep in her arms, and smiled. Life wasn't perfect, but it was real. And for Marcus, that was more than enough. "I finally understand what matters," Marcus whispered, his voice full of quiet conviction. Natalie smiled back at him, her eyes filled with love. "And what's that?" "Family. Love. Letting go of control." He paused, taking in the warmth of the moment. "I'm not afraid of the future anymore. Whatever comes, we'll face it together." As the fire crackled softly, Marcus felt the peace he had searched for all his life settle over him. He hadn't won in the traditional sense, he hadn't conquered the world or achieved some grand victory. But he had found something far more valuable. He had found himself. Hey there, thank you so much for watching. If you connected with this story, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and let us know what resonated with you the most. Your feedback means the world to us. And don't forget, subscribe to our channel so you never miss a new story. We've got more emotional, heart-gripping content coming your way, and trust me, you won't want to miss it. Before you go, check out the next story popping up on your screen. It's one that will leave you on the edge of your seat. Hit that play button now.